guest, Dr. Pinaki Chakraborty. Dr. Pinaki is the former director of National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi. Prior to this, he was the chief social policy UNICEF and the chief of field office UNICEF Kerala and Tamil Nadu. He served as a member advisory council of the 15th Finance Commission of India. He was a member secretary Committee on Fiscal Statistics appointed by the National Statistical Commission in 2017 and the chairman Kerala Public Expenditure Review Committee, Government of Kerala, and research associate at Levy Economics Institute in New York. Dr. Chakraborty has critical domain knowledge of the public finances of the national and state governments and has served on the advisory committees of various research institutions in India. He has also held short-term visiting appointments in the Department of Economics at the University of Ottawa and the University of Carleton and the Center of Development Studies affiliated at Jawaharlal Nehru University and in New Delhi, and taught Indian public finance course at Indira Gandhi Institute for Development Research in Mumbai. So that's why you can now understand why we are feeling delighted today to have with us Dr. Chakraborty to share his expert opinion on a very important topic, global economic uncertainties and macroeconomic policies. So as you all know, the world economy has been burned by substantial uncertainties in recent years, initially due to coronavirus outbreak and then due to the Russian-Ukraine war, and the global macroeconomic picture continues to evolve because of the rise in commodity price, deficit in trade balance, and instability in financial markets. So the global economic uncertainties have also been influenced by the effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policy and their transmission challenges, especially in southern economies. So now I would like to invite Dr. Chakraborty to share with us his viewpoints on this important topic. Dr. Chakraborty.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Evatal Adam. Good morning, dear students. Today I am going to speak on global economic uncertainties and macroeconomic policies. I have decided to speak for maybe an hour, and then I can take your questions, comments, clarifications, but you can ask in between if you want any clarification that you may need during the course of the lecture. So to start with, I must say that I have decided to speak on the subject of global economic uncertainties, and let me start with a quote from the book titled Financial and Fiscal Policies, Crisis and New Realities by Dr. Y.V. Reddy, Narayan Valluri, and Dr. Partho Roy. In this book, while narrating the likely impact of the global financial crisis, which happened in 2008, 9, and 10, they mentioned, and I quote, the quote starts, Lord Keynes once said that it is worthwhile to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. This is particularly relevant when one is addressing evolving public policy issues in a rapidly changing global economic environment in the context of global financial and economic crisis. Today, in this lecture, I am not intending to do a rigorous quantification of uncertainties through macroeconometric modeling. My attempt is to present before you what in my view is uncertain in comparison to economic trends we observed during the COVID you observe before the COVID and the war, and what are the available options for macro policy in general, and the role of fiscal policy and fiscal rules in challenging macroeconomic environment. At the outset, let me make it clear that I am not talking about the global, I'm talking about the global economy, and will draw inferences and draw references to India wherever necessary. So, please keep that in mind. Now, when we talk about macroeconomic uncertainties, let me start with the key factors that I think are critically important to highlight as the reasons for macroeconomic uncertainty. Why are we calling, today we are talking about global economic uncertainties and macroeconomic policies. Probably we would not have done this 3 years back, right? So there is a reason why we are talking about it. So what are those uncertainties, and how do you deal with such uncertainties become very, very important. Now, if we look at global economic data published by multilateral institutions like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, IMF, and if you really look at macro data, you will see there are 3 kinds of challenges that the global economy is facing. And these 3 challenges are unprecedented challenges. One is the growth slowdown in 2020. Now you may ask a question that growth has slowed down in the past many times, yet recovered. So what is so uncertain about it? Second, so I'll answer that question. Second is the elevated levels of debt and deficit. Debt and deficits globally have gone up. The rising cost of fuel and other intermediate commodities, you must have read in newspaper, has experienced the cost of fuel, resulting in sharp rise in prices. And fourth, I think, is the serious disruption in supply chain due to the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, resulting in shortage of basic essentials like food and energy in some parts of the world. The fear of prolonged global recession is looming large, because we are all talking about recession is going to come, is already there, and how that is going to affect the global economy. Let me explain the magnitude of the problem with some data recently published by the IMF, and this also would give us a sense of why this time we are calling it an uncertainty, not a slowdown in a normal situation. Now let me start with the growth slowdown. According to the IMF's World Economic Outlook, April 2022, that means it was only a few months back, and it was titled as "War Sets Back the Global Recovery." So it's not talking about pandemic, it's talking about war. The war sets back the global recovery. Economic damage from the conflict will contribute to a significant slowdown in global growth in 2022 and add to inflation. According to the same IMF report, global growth is projected to slow from an estimated 6.1% in 2021 to 3.6% in 22 and 23. So there is a reduction in the forecast of growth by almost 50% in few months. And beyond 2023, global growth is forecast to decline to about 3.3% over the medium term. So there is also a fear that the recovery will take time, so it is not going to happen immediately. So there has been a downward revision of the growth outlook of the global economy. Growth recovery across countries continue to remain uneven. For example, if we look at India, India is growing at more than 13%, but there are global economies which are growing at less than 2-3%. There are parts of the world economy where growth rate is less than 2%. So there is uneven growth recovery across countries. This has implications for fiscal policy, revenue mobilization, and debt sustainability. Now, second issue that I mentioned, why uncertainty is an uncertainty now, is the level of debt and deficit. The general government debt, general government means one country can have central government, can have state governments, can have local governments, and governments at all levels borrow resources to finance public expenditure. So general government debt means the combined debt of all the governments. It does not include the debt of the public sector. So if there is a public sector borrowing, that's not part of this debt. So it's only the debt of the government. Public sector is bigger than the government, right? I mean, public sector plus government will have a larger debt than the government itself. So the general government debt to GDP ratio for the advanced economies is now hovering around 120% of GDP. That means the debt is more than the GDP. For the emerging and middle income countries, this ratio is around 60%. Though the global debt to GDP ratio stabilized during the fiscal year 2021, that means it did not increase. It remained at that level. Though the global debt to GDP ratio stabilized during the fiscal year 2021, IMF Fiscal Monitor 2021 observed that, and I quote, "The pandemic will leave a lasting mark on government finances, inequality, poverty, and the level of debt of GDP and the level of GDP in many countries." It further noted that following this one-time jump in debt to GDP ratio, debt in coming year is expected to remain persistently higher than the levels projected before the pandemic. In advanced economies, it is projected to be almost 20 percentage points higher than 2026. These elevated levels of both debt in both developed and developing economies need to be financed. So if you borrowed, you have to pay it back. It's not a grant. So how will it be financed when you have such high level of deficit and debt? How do we finance this increasing debt servicing cost without reducing other essential expenditures, say on health, education, rural development, livelihood security, social protection? How do we finance these expenditure, particularly on health, education, and livelihood securities, remain uncertain. Globally, I am talking about. Third uncertainty is the rising cost of fuel and high inflation. Some data that I have collected for the purpose of this lecture show that war-induced commodity price increases and broadening price measures have led to 2022 inflation projection of 5.7% in advanced economies and 8.7% in emerging market and developing economies. Rising inflation is hitting the poorest regions of the world the most. Staple food prices in sub-Saharan Africa surged by an average 23.9% in 2022. The most since the 2008 global financial crisis. So it's not only in general inflation, food price inflation is very high. And if you look at food price inflation is really creating major disruption in the availability of food in one of the most poorest region of the world. So that is Africa. Given that these economic vulnerabilities have arisen due to the unusual events like COVID and war, conventional policy tools that are used to arrest downturn or cyclical movement of the economy may not be adequate. So standard macroeconomic prescriptions may not be may not be adequate. Policy tool itself has its own limitations in a situation like this. However, if we look at the sequence of events, we observed some common policy elements across countries. What are the commonalities featured in the global macro policy during the COVID and is still continuing? So I have tried to analyze those commonalities, and I would highlight 4. There are many other commonalities, but major ones. Commonality 1, countries across the world provided fiscal stimulus to deal with the crisis. You must have read, you must have seen. Globally, the tool used as a fiscal stimulus, estimates show that it is around, in the year 2021, it was around $17,000 billion US dollar. Now, if we look at the composition of this $17,000 billion, government guarantees, that means government has not borrowed. Somebody borrowed, government has given a guarantee. So the government guarantees accounted for more than 4,000 billion US dollar. So almost 25% of the total fiscal stimulus that was given in the year 2020 was in the form of guarantees. What does that mean? That means this money is not yet reflecting where? In the budget. So it is not reflected in the budget. So I have to, if you, in the event of a default, I will support. So it's not reflected in the budget, but money is there. It has been borrowed, but there is a liability which is not reflected in the budget. So if there is a liability which is not reflected in the budget, and if these guarantees in future are invoked, that means it will become a government liability. So the 120% debt to GDP ratio that I talked about a little while ago does not include this $4,000 billion because it is not accounted as debt because it is a guarantee. So roughly 1/4 of the total is a guarantee. So government says that okay, that much of amount I really cannot borrow, so I am giving you guarantee, you go and borrow and try to create fiscal space for spending. The downside fiscal risk of which cannot be ignored, as I said, it may come to the government budget when government has to support these guarantees. If there is a large default, it can weaken the fiscal balance sheet in the medium term for items that are below the line item at the moment and not reflecting in the budget. That's the first commonality, and that is true for all the countries, whether it is a developed country, whether it's a developing country, whether it is a low-income developing country, everywhere the situation is same. What is the second commonality? The second commonality is that central banks now are increasing interest rates to deal with rising inflation. So everywhere we see a rise in interest rate. You must have seen the kind of reactions financial markets had when US raised their interest rate. India also raised its interest rate. Other emerging market economies are raising interest rate. UK has raised interest rate very recently. So there was this accommodative monetary policy stance that central bank would provide liquidity to support COVID-induced macroeconomic uncertainty. So liquidity in the system was very high during COVID and also in the year 21 large part of 22. Now these liquidities are now being sucked out of the system by increasing the interest rate because the inflation is very high. Now how much interest rate will, at what level of interest rate, how much effective that policy tool would be, depends on host of other factors. But when it comes to a central bank, the policy tools that are there with them are very limited, whether it is a normal time or a crisis period or an abnormal time. So the first thing the banks have done, they have given an indication that I am going to slowly change my policy stance from an accommodative stance to more towards management of inflation. Okay? And this is again common across the countries, irrespective of their level of per capita income and development. Third commonality that I wanted to highlight here is the increase in money supply. The increase in money supply has been significant. What was the increase in money supply during the last 2 years to support the government to deal with COVID? How does money supply go up to support government? One way is to print money and give to the government. So that's called monetization of deficit. So many countries have resorted to monetization of deficit. In India also there was a lot of pressures on the government to go for money financing of deficit. That means central bank would print money and give it to the government. So India had this policy of money financing of deficit during the era of early years of planned financing, and it continued up to 1996. In 1996, Government of India and Reserve Bank of India signed an agreement that monetization of deficit will be discontinued. And since then, we have not monetized deficit. And I am very glad that during the COVID time also, government did not resort to monetizations. Why I am against monetization? It's an easy money. So if you start getting money as a government very easily from the central bank, there is always a temptation to be fiscally expansive, because you know that you can always ask the Reserve Bank of India or any central bank for that matter that monetize is very important. So I think monetization is not a very good way of dealing with resource non-availability of resources. So, and India I think has managed it quite well. Yes. Yeah, kind of. A lot of people talk about helicopter money. Some also argue about, money financing of program. So you say that I am not going to finance everything. There will be no direct monetization. There will be direct monetization, but it is not for the budget, but for a particular program. So if we say that, a lot of people argue that, okay, you give, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, right? So he said that if you don't have money, just finance that program by through monetization of deficit. Or a public works program, say building of roads, rural roads, finance it by printing money. So that is another. So one is helicopter money, you just drop and then government spends. Where it spends, you don't know. Second option is that, okay, no, a conditional helicopter money. So you give the money when there is a particular, for a specific need. So that is the second option that you can do. But I think both the options are very problematic, because after all it increases your monetized deficit, and if your monetized deficit becomes a regular feature, then you will really not be, temptation would be to be fiscally always expansive. So that's the problem. It also has implications for the functioning of the debt market, functioning of the public sector banks, etc. I am not going into those details, but generally it's avoidable. But what I am saying that all of you can disagree or agree, because there are alternative views. Some say money financing is fine. What is the problem? Okay.
For a country like India, in order to run all these social programs, we need money.
Yeah, so I said you mobilize taxes. That is also money.
So, but in our country, the tax rate is, the taxation amount we get from the tax money is not that. And so it's important for a country like India to have a moderate helicopter money or something.
Yeah, there are 2-3 things. One is, what is India's tax to GDP ratio? India's tax to GDP ratio is around, if you take center and states together, is around 16 to 17% of GDP. Okay, the global average is around 9%. Okay, and India doesn't have a social security tax. Social security tax is basically you pay back, right? So it's basically not a tax; it's actually a savings. So we are at 17-18% of GDP as taxes consistently. It should be more. Nobody is saying that it should be less. But the point here is, if we say that as I mobilize less amount of taxes, I should finance more my programs to money financing, I am actually increasing money supply in the economy because of fiscal operation. And when I increase money supply due to fiscal operation, given that it can put pressure on interest rate, on inflation, and inflation being the implicit tax on the system, and most regressive tax, because the poor get disproportionately more affected by inflation than the rich. So in such a situation, you certainly have to worry about money financing. What is the level of money financing? So I can do money financing. I think in today's context, it's very important to run certain programs, so I'll do money financing, but its adverse consequences cannot be ignored. And if it leads to high inflation, high deficit, high interest liabilities in turn, because you will have large debt, and it will, so these things have to be carefully considered. So there are positives. The positive is what you are saying, that we make resources available where it is needed most. Fine. But whether that is going to have a long run sustainable impact is an issue that also you have to see, because if the inflation takes away half of the money that I have earned as an MG and RDJ worker, I don't know. If your real wages fall because of the increase in inflation, I don't know. So these are certain issues, and also if we become fiscally profligate consistently, because there is cheap money available from the central bank, then fiscal prudence goes for a, fiscal prudence is seriously compromised. So and if we don't have fiscal prudence, macro instability occurs. You have a large debt, you look at what has happened in Sri Lanka. So we really cannot have fiscally imprudent management of public finances. So that's the primary concern I have when we talk about money financing. Okay. Now let me tell you some data. Now we are all talking about US never experienced this level of inflation, and sometimes we say this is going to create, this has created recession, and how is it going to work? And people attribute a lot of reasons for this. But for me, as an economist, primary reason is the increase in money supply. Now the increase in money supply has been significant. What was the increase in money supply during the last 2 years to support the government to deal with the COVID? Information on that is very sketchy because you really don't get those information because you have to look at the Federal Reserve's balance sheets, Bank of England's balance sheets, a big top 5 top 5 central banks balance sheet you have to look at. So what I did, I looked at the World Development Indicators data that is available online, published by the World Bank. World Development Indicators gives data on monetary aggregates, compiled from the International Financial Statistics of IMF. The growth of the central banks, there is an item called the growth of central banks, the growth of the central banks claims on central government. The claims on central government is an indicator of, that means you have a claim on central government, no? If you are a federal bank, Federal Reserve, or if you are Reserve Bank of India, or for that matter, Bank of England, or European Commercial Central Bank, so you have a claim on government. When you have a claim on government, you have a claim on government once you have lent to the government. So claim on, and there can be other claims also, but those are minor components. So claim on central government provides some idea of the additional increase in money supply due to the government operation during COVID. Even if not a precise estimate, these data on claim on central government reflects an increase in money supply due to the central bank's support to the government during COVID. It showed a sharp increase among major advanced economies. The inflation that you see is partly because of that. I would say primarily because of that. In the US, immediately after the global financial crisis in 2010, the growth of central bank support to the government was 0.4%. Growth means 2009 over 2008. That growth was just 0.4%. In the year 2020, that means during the year of crisis, this support increased to 9%. It was above 9% in UK, 10.5% in Brazil, 6% in China. So that's the level of monetary expansion we see during 2 crises. One was global financial crisis, other was the COVID crisis. So what is the fourth commonality? The fourth commonality is both domestic and external debt stock increased sharply during the pandemic. Both domestic and external debt stock increased sharply during the pandemic. The internal debt statistics published by the IMF for the year 2022 for all the developing countries show that external debt to export ratio for 123 low and middle income countries increased from 101% in 2018 to 123% in 2020. So if your debt to export ratio goes up, and this is external debt, you cannot pay your external debt through your domestic currency, right? Nobody will accept. So you have to finance your external debt servicing cost from your forex reserves, export earning, and debt to export ratio has crossed for all the low and middle income countries more than 100, has become more than 100%, and it increased from 2008 to 2020, the increase was by 23 percentage points. So there's a sharp increase in the export to debt ratio for this. And if you look at export to debt service ratio, that also increased from 14 to 17%. That means the foreign exchange earning that a country had, 17% of that was going to service the external debt servicing cost. That's a huge amount. The share of public sector external debt in total external debt increased from 37% to 39%. So public sector borrowing also in the external debt basket went up. And this is different for different countries. These are highly disruptive macroeconomic challenges. If we look at what has happened in Sri Lanka, what is happening in our neighborhood in other countries, these are primarily because of high exposure to external debt, borrowed dollar denominated external debt. So you have to finance it by earning dollars, and if you are not earning dollars, you are not able to repay. So somebody else will come and repay, and if somebody else comes and repays, then there are other issues involved. So the complexity that we see in terms of the crisis in the neighborhood is partly related to that.
So how effective has been the currency swap agreements?
Well, it works only at the margin if you have a large external debt exposure. Second thing is, if we look at overall debt restructuring happening across the countries, this debt restructuring is happening only primarily, not only, primarily for debt which are already contracted at a very favorable terms and conditions. For example, multilateral debt from multilateral institutions. Their interest rates are not very high. Now you are saying that, okay, you restructure debt, but the kind of commercial borrowing done, external commercial borrowing done at the market rate of interest, how do you restructure that? A private commercial borrower may not be, it's not easy to bring him to the table to discuss debt restructuring. Okay. Secondly, when your exchange rate depreciates, your debt servicing cost goes up. Because you contracted debt at, say, exchange rate 60 rupees. I am giving India as an example just to bring this point. Now, if the exchange rate becomes 80, then apart from the rate of interest, because of the depreciation of rupee, effective rate of interest goes up by how? 60 to 20 means what? 60 and 80 are just two numbers. By another 10-15%. So actually the external borrowing that you say that you can borrow at 2%, 3%, 4% in a currency which is not under your control, I think it's a very risky proposition. Thankfully, India doesn't have large external debt exposure. India's budget is mostly financed by domestic resources. So Indians pay for its own budget. So our government is not financed by domestic. Private borrowers can always borrow from external commercial sources. That's a private contract. It does not expose the government. So that way the risk is much less. But that's not the case in many other countries. Now, these are highly disruptive challenges for macroeconomic management. Reduction of debt takes time, but management of inflation cannot wait. You can say that debt will come down after 3 years, we have started taking steps, restructuring and things like that. So reduction of debt takes time, management of inflation can't wait. So these options are very, very complex. Going forward, the global economy needs a coordinated policy, and I emphasize a coordinated policy for monetary tightening and fiscal sustainability. There is a need to start fiscal normalization. It's absolutely important in my view, without creating adverse distributional consequences. What do I mean by adverse distributional consequences? If I say that, informal sector has shrunk, Unemployment rate is still very high. Economy is getting back to normal, so more jobs will have to be created. Till economy becomes fully vibrant and creates sufficient amount of job. Till that time we need to provide certain kind of livelihood support to those who need most. We must continue to do that. But to say that we really can do everything simultaneously, that would increase the debt, because debt has already gone up. So within government, if we have to do a kind of reprioritization globally, I think that reprioritization is very important. So, and for these countries need to chart out a fiscal normalization. That's why I said for these countries need to chart out a fiscal normalization plan to ensure that it is not abrupt. So suddenly I stopped everything that I was doing. I think the COVID infection has come down to less than certain numbers, so it's all right now, we stop. We really cannot do that, but we need to sequence it in a manner that helps bring back the economy on track, enhance fiscal resources for the government for public investment in the social and economic sector, and create a framework for sector-specific differentiated response for a full recovery. I'll explain this a little later. Finally, the money spent by low-income developing countries to deal with the COVID was far less than the advanced and emerging market economies. And most of this spending was on health and emergency response. I'll just give you an example. Now, if we look at country-specific fiscal stimulus data provided by IMF again, so average for the advanced economies will be more than 15% of GDP, it's roughly around 20% of GDP. Then emerging market economies like India has spent around 12-13% of GDP. It was quite significant. Then you have got this set of countries which are categorized in the IMF's classification as low-income developing countries. Their response, fiscal stimulus, was around 2 to 3% of GDP. Now, if we look at US response to global, to pandemic, it is around 20%, and this extra 20%, if we disaggregate, only 10% of this 20% of GDP, 10% of this 20% of GDP was spent on health and emergency response, because the money was so large, that much money you cannot spend overnight on health. And that was sufficient to deal with the crisis, because in terms of creating health facilities, providing vaccination, quarantine, whatever. So rest 90% was for support, livelihood support. Only 10% I spent on health and emergency response to deal with COVID. Rest 90% was for supporting livelihood and for economic recovery. But if you look at Africa, the total stimulus was around 3% of GDP. And out of this 3% of GDP, 55% of that 3% was spent on health and emergency response. 55 to 60. That means the money available for support and economic recovery was almost not there. Okay, so when the countries emerge out of COVID, it will emerge as a more unequal economies of the world. Because some of the countries have spent more, some of the countries have supported more because they had more money, they have increased their debt, but some of the countries just managed the crisis because that was the money available. You also see that in the inequality in vaccination, because some parts of the world are still not even vaccinated, fully vaccinated. So this inequality in terms of access to the basic health needs during the crisis, post-COVID fiscal response which was very unequal, and recovery that you see now is an outcome of that. You see a very uneven recovery across the globe. So global inequality, that is why is again increasing. A lot of people are discussing about why there is an increase in inequality. The increase in inequality is because the way we responded to the crisis, there was no global coordination. We have closed borders, we have closed movement, we have stopped supporting kind of each other, and then then somehow those who survived have emerged stronger, some emerge more strong than others, and some continue to remain weak. So that's the situation that we are in. So given this, rethinking about fiscal rule in times of crisis becomes very important. So what kind of fiscal rules countries have? By fiscal rule, I mean the amount the government should borrow. That's the rule. In India, government of India can borrow up to 3% of GDP. European Union can borrow up to 3% of GDP, can have only 60% of debt to GDP ratio. US also has certain rules. So given this, there is a rethinking of fiscal rules that is absolutely necessary. Flexibility to create fiscal space. There are several, but to me, following here critically important. Flexibility to create fiscal space. So when you are talking about rules, we need to make rules fiscally flexible, because rigidity can create constraint. Because I am also saying that you cannot monetize. So under no situation I would support monetization, but then there has to be some flexibility to fiscal space. So you have to make a flexible fiscal rule. But when you make it flexible, it should also be effective. If it is not effective, you just make it flexible, your debt to GDP ratio will keep on increasing. And third issue that you need to consider is the issue of long run debt sustainability. Flexible fiscal rules and creation of fiscal space. Let me start with the flexibility in fiscal rule. Flexibility can have two dimensions. One is increasing the borrowing limit itself. So you borrow up to 3% of GDP, let us make it 10% of GDP. So that gives you flexibility. This would provide more resources to the government for making intervention necessary to deal with the macroeconomic challenges, isn't it? But this is a difficult option to exercise given that already deficit and debt levels are high. In a macroeconomic scenario, when interest rates are increasing deficit would mean more high cost borrowing. Because the interest rates are also going up, right? We are trying to manage inflation. So at this point in time, we also say that we borrow more, we will be contracting debt at a higher rate of interest. And if we are contracting debt at a higher rate of interest, we will have a debt servicing. The debt servicing cost will increase, and naturally, that would create pressure on primary expenditure. So debt minus interest payment minus the total expenditure minus interest payment is the primary expenditure. So your primary expenditure will go down. So you will spend less on health, education, etc. Other option is flexibility in terms of time. We say that we don't monitor the debt every year. So you don't say that this year it should be X, next year it will be Y, then Z. No. We say there is an option to bring down the debt and deficit to a sustainable level within a time frame without specifying the limit of yearly reduction. This is the framework adopted by the 15th Finance Commission of India. 15th Finance Commission of India proposed that yes, these are your indicative debt to GDP ratio, and by the end of 25-26 your debt to GDP ratio should be this. That's what they have said. Of course, they have given a path. And also the fiscal deficit. But debt rule, Government of India also said that in 22-23 budget that they will bring down the fiscal deficit to 4.5% of GDP by 25-26. But they haven't said what will be the debt to GDP ratio in 23-24 or 24-25. So you can fix a terminal year, a terminal debt, of reduction in debt to GDP ratio, reduction in deficit, but you ensure that yearly you reduce in a manner that gives you flexibility, yet you reduce the debt to GDP ratio. So that is the second option. For me, another option that could be considered is the debt rule. Instead of having a deficit rule, we target deficit. We said that it should not be more than 3%. So we are targeting the flow. We are not target deficit is a flow, right? So this year's debt is a stock. So debt rule is another option, more flexible than deficit rule. But there is no comprehensive measure of public debt. I mentioned in the beginning saying that government debt does not include the debt of the public sector. If we have to ensure fiscal rule solely based on the reduction of debt to GDP ratio, the measure of debt is not comprehensive in most countries. Thus, appropriate fiscal transparency and most appropriate measure of debt would be important, can help in taking debt rule as a measure of fiscal consolidation. So you say that I am going to, because if you reduce your debt, you also reduce your debt servicing cost. Is it true? Suppose I reduce my debt by inflation. Debt is not indexed to inflation, right? Suppose I took a house loan or a car loan. A lot of people do that, right? So inflation reduces my liability, right? Isn't it? No? The real value of the debt has gone down. Okay. So high inflation means in real terms a lower liability, lower level of liability. So inflation can knock off a part of the debt. Okay? Since debt is always contracted in nominal terms. Debt is not contracted in real terms. Since debt is contracted in nominal terms, the inflation can knock off your debt. So your debt to GDP ratio can come down. But what you have to ensure then is the interest payment to revenue receipt ratio should come down with the reduction in debt to GDP ratio. So debt rule should always be supported by interest payment to revenue receipt rule. So if you want to knock off debt, you should also monitor what is happening to the interest payment to revenue receipt ratio. So if a combination of debt rule supported by interest rule is proposed or a framework is created, I think that would really help in giving flexibility to the government, ensure effectiveness and long run debt sustainability. What is effectiveness of rules in times of crisis? The effectiveness argument emanates from the fact that it brings down debt level without reducing the fiscal space for development spending. Isn't it? In this context, we also need to take a broader view of the revenue and capital expenditure. There are two kinds of expenditure: current consumption expenditure, spending on health, spending on education, spending on rural development, spending on salaries, pension, interest payment. These are all current consumption expenditure. These are part of your day-to-day spending. But creating assets like roads, buildings, hospitals, these are all capital spending. But then this distinction is not very comprehensive, because creation of human capital is also should be considered as a capital expenditure, right? So I think in this context, when you talk about effectiveness argument, it emanates from the fact that it brings down the debt level without reducing the fiscal space for development spending. And development includes both health education expenditure as well as the expenditure for building public sector assets in terms of the physical assets. To give an example, physical assets creation and creation of human capital need not be based on the principle of substitution. So only one can replace the other. That's not the idea. It cannot be based on the principles of substitution, but it should be based on the principles of complementarity. We need a more nuanced view when we try to make a distinction between revenue and capital expenditure. The distinction between revenue and capital expenditure often appears artificial because a large complementarity between the two always exists. In conclusion, when the global economy is recovering from the shock of the pandemic, a careful approach to fiscal expansion cannot be emphasized more. Rebalancing fiscal expenditure between redistribution and growth in a time like this is extremely challenging. The focus on capital spending is an instrument of choice. Capital investment will help us. We should make more capital investment. What is underlying assumption? The underlying assumption is that it will create a virtuous cycle of growth and development spending. So I make more capital investment, it creates more jobs, it creates more income, and then more revenues, and then it creates a virtuous cycle. But if that does not happen, and pressure to increase revenue expenditure goes up because then you have to support individuals, we may end up at a higher level of deficit, larger debt, and reduced space for primary spending due to the enhanced debt servicing cost. So we need to look at rebalancing in a continuous way. You cannot say that it's a continuous process. We have to do it, especially in times of uncertainties, very carefully. It's an everyday monitoring that one needs to do. Last point is on the long run debt sustainability. The long run debt sustainability should always be focused on growth recovery, interest rate, and the level of primary deficit. What is primary deficit? Primary deficit is fiscal deficit minus interest payment. The fiscal deficit is this year's borrowing, but interest payment is an outcome of your past borrowing, because that is your debt servicing cost. So the government of the day has no control over the interest liabilities emerging. So primary deficit is what they are responsible for in year T. So the long run debt sustainability should always be focused on growth recovery, interest rate, and the level of primary deficit. The fiscal vulnerabilities need separate analysis when we talk about debt sustainability. To normalize, we need a clear assessment of the quantum of fiscal shock that happened due to COVID. This COVID created a fiscal shock in the system. How it happened? What was the quantum? We need to have a clear understanding, and we do that adjustment. A time path for, so don't have two paths of recovery. One is COVID, other is non-COVID related fiscal expansion. This increase in the debt to GDP ratio across countries also resulted in reassessment of the conventional wisdom of fiscal rule and accumulation of public debt. There are many papers. In a recent paper, it has been shown that this is a paper by Ardens and others observed that in 75 advanced and emerging economies with either no fiscal rule or with a rigid fiscal rule, a fiscal consolidation of at least 2 percentage points of GDP is associated with an average 10% reduction in public investment. Instead, in countries with flexible fiscal rules, the negative effect of fiscal adjustment on public investment vanishes, which implies that flexible rules protect public investment during the consolidation episode. So there are many other papers that talks about such issues. Government of India's economic survey also said that, that for India and other EMEs, which have consistently grown their GDP at high rates over the last few decades, the relationship between debt and growth exhibits a clear direction of causality. Higher growth lowers debt to GDP ratios, but lower debt does not necessarily lead to higher growth. So there are views on debt, and that needs to be carefully examined. The preceding discussion, the shows that the post-COVID fiscal consolidation is emerging as a major issue as countries deal with large deficit, debt, high inflation, and uneven economic recovery. Though in the short run, necessary flexibility for the creation of fiscal space to be provided through higher borrowing, there is a need to return to a sustainable fiscal management for macro stability and growth. And there we have to take a medium-term view. The economic shock in terms of GDP contraction due to the COVID, though reversed in the fiscal year 21-22 in most countries, a stable and sustained recovery is needed. The medium-term fiscal policy cum fiscal strategy statement presented as a part of the Union Budget of India 2023 mentioned that deficit will be reduced to 4.5% of GDP by 25-26. Now, if we take all this into account, I would say that the post-COVID fiscal consolidation is emerging as a major issue to deal with large deficit and debt, high inflation, and to deal with uneven recovery. And if we have to really manage this issue of debt and deficit, we need to take a medium-term view with a focus on reduction in debt to GDP ratio. Now, all these have further been complicated by the war. War has created a huge supply chain issues, created disruptions in supply of basic essential foods and oil, basic essential like food and oil, and food deficit in countries are increasing. There are 48 countries who are in food deficit. That's what the data shows, published by the IMF. So basic essential items, supply chain disruption is a concern, and that also has a fiscal cost, because you cannot just allow as a government, for people to, not having food, not having access to food. So I think the fiscal cost of that estimated to be also very high. If these 48 countries who are in food deficit, luckily India is a food surplus country. It actually is also supporting many countries who are in short of the food supply. So I think then comes oil. So, and then uncertain global economic environment also has an implications on export, and then the exchange rate. So these are the issues that we need to deal with as we move along. And why I said this uncertainty is to be discussed. I think this uncertainty needs to be discussed because this is the macro policy tools need to really consider how do you deal with this unprecedented situation where you had a pandemic which restricted the mobility both for labor, also in a way capital, because you could not invest during that time. Capital mobility was also restricted. Labor mobility within the country was restricted. And then your debt and deficit went up to support people when they were not able to make resources available for their own livelihood. So there is a fundamental difference between the global financial crisis and the pandemic. During the pandemic, the crisis emerged at the household level, real sector. In the case of global financial crisis, the crisis emerged in the banks. So you bailed out few banks, the crisis was over. It's a much bigger crisis. It's a crisis at individuals level. It's a crisis of health, it's a crisis of education, it's a crisis of earnings, crisis of creation of job, crisis of investment. So the dimension of this crisis is much more severe and intense compared to the global financial crisis. That severity and intensity has been further catalyzed by the war between Russia and Ukraine. And since Ukraine is a major supplier of food grains, so there is a short supply of food in certain parts of the world. Russia, a major supplier of oil. Again, oil is becoming a major issue. This has implications for inflation. This has implications for, macro management. This has implications for fiscal policy, how fiscal policy should deal with such emergencies. So these needs to be considered. And then also another issue that is creating on top of that, creating major problem at the global level is the issue of climate. So climate crisis, intensity of climate related disasters are making more and more people vulnerable, are creating a major livelihood crisis, making more and more people vulnerable. So there is also a need to think about how do you create at the global level a shock responsive social protection mechanism. So when there is a crisis, you are able to provide support as a government. So these are certain issues that how do you reduce the intensity of climate risk, climate related disasters? How do you make investment for that? So it's not only about education, it's not only about health, it's not only about livelihood. It is also about preventing crisis. So imposed by climate change, and we are talking about it, but I think all the countries make a lot of commitment, but the kind of investment required is and actual investment made, there's a huge gap. So that is another area at the global level that we need to consider and work on. Last but not the least, if we are talking about climate issues, I think we must understand the climate issue is also very unequal. The impact of climate on poor women and children are much more than the rich and wealthy. So that is another area where global action is required, coordinated policy action is required, because climate is a global public good. So if you have to, and if it's a global public good and there is no market, who has to make investment? It's the government which has to make investment. You cannot go and buy a good climate model for the world and your CO2 emission goes down. There is no market. It has to. So this is a classic example of market failure. So if there is no market, it is the government which has to make sure that it doesn't happen. And improving climate in Delhi, or improving climate in Haryana, or improving climate in some other parts of the world is not restricted to the improvement in that territory only. It's cross-cutting, right? It has large externalities across countries. So if I say that I am going to improve the climate condition in my country or my territory or in my local area, it's not going to work. So climate finance, climate action, climate policy needs global coordination, global action. So unless we do that, meaningful action, it's not statement. So unless we do that, I'll come back. So unless we do that, I think this inequality is going to persist and only going to intensify the problem. So these are certain issues at the global level that becomes, in a macro sense, very important. So I thought I'll speak about those issues, and certainly one lecture is not enough, but I hope you got a sense of what my view on these issues are, and I'll be happy to take your questions. Yes?
Since you mentioned that during the COVID crisis, the developed countries had so much of money to invest on their recovery process. But when it comes to climate financing, they are so reluctant to use. I mean, why? What politics is going on inside there? Why so much of they are being so stingy in terms of climate financing? They're not ready for it. When they have they had contributed trillions of dollars for COVID financing, but in terms of climate, when everyone is being affected, they are not ready to do so.
Yeah, it has got climate issues are very unequal globally, and that is where I think it's very important for emerging economies like emerging global economies, with a lot of influence to take actions, because the benefits of climate disaster, the benefits of climate disaster before it happened was exploited by the developed world. So today the benefits, so they're the beneficiary of the climate disaster. So the way trees were cut, the way power was consumed, the way coal was mined, the way country after country was, without having consideration for the ecology and environment, the way profit was extracted from extracting industries across the globe. It was not done by poor, it was done by rich. Okay, so the climate disaster benefited some people, and we have reached to a level. It's not because somebody doing something terribly wrong in poorer part of the world. It's largely because of the way development models have been in the Western and developed world. So and they are not willing to take that take that privileges back, because that will affect their lifestyle, way of living, comfort. So they say that you are more populous, even though per capita consumption of carbon is much less, but you consume more in terms of volume. So you act. I won't act. Okay, so why should I act? So it's very simple at the ground level if you look at. So that's what is happening. So, and global action is not supported by local action, no. So there is a global commitment. Some countries do. India is trying to focus a lot on renewable energy, etc., solar. But India doing alone will not help. My climate action helps everyone, but my climate inaction also helps everybody, right? Affects everybody. So that is the issue. So unless there is global coordination on climate issues, we are not able to do it. Now we hear about issues about carbon taxation. You just cannot say carbon taxation. A government has to tax, and tax cannot be something vague. You cannot say I'll tax carbon. How? What is the tax rate?
Blanket taxes don't work on carbon emissions anyways.
So what is the tax base? What will be the carbon tax pricing? At what rate I'll tax? How can you make the market for carbon more efficient? These are the issues that you should discuss before it is too late. And since private sector are not going to make investment because it does not have any immediate profit, right? And why should we expect private sector to do it? So if there is no market, private sector role is limited. So in that case, it is the government which has to do it. So I think apart from education, health, social sector, nutrition, roads, telecommunication anyway is private. So now these days. So but you also need to take climate as a main policy agenda of development. So that is extremely important.
Also here I think that in developed countries, business sector, capitalism are exerting also influence over governments, and they are stopping them from moving forward in their climate policies. like what Trump has when in time of Paris Agreement they have stopped these things. Yeah, so also capitalism is playing a role there in developed countries. What do you think? What is your opinion on this, Professor?
Yeah, I would say the point that I have already made. I think it requires them to, you know, make significant cut in their, you know, in their way of investment that they do, the kind of investment they also need to do to change the way production and consumption structure is defined. It will be very, very high. So that nobody is willing to do. So, and this will have a, now if we say that, you know, you stop your coal mines. So India has its coal mine in eastern India, right? So you have it in Jharkhand, you have it in West Bengal, and you have stopped functioning of the coal mine. Now the point here is, it's very difficult because it's not only carbon. It has got to do with health, it has got to do with livelihood, it has got to do with the local economy, because it's not about somebody, you know, extracting coal and going away. So there are a lot of things associated with it. So these complexities of, you know, we also have become very, you know, you get carried away by all these, you know, elite jargons, just transition. You define, you tell me that number. What is that? What is that? Just transition. We always like a transition which is just. I don't understand. So a lot of good words, but we support it. Should be supported by a lot of good actions also. I am not saying that nothing is happening, but I think more needs to happen.
So, sir, by suggesting that there needs to be a global cooperation, are you also suggesting that the global south should lower their expectations from the west and take the whole historical responsibility narrative and start taking action towards fiscal action towards climate change, or are you suggesting?
I think there are already fiscal action towards climate change. If we look at the first public expenditure review of fiscal policy, public expenditure review of climate financing happened in Nepal. Okay, it hasn't happened in. It has happened next door. Nepal was the first country to have a climate expenditure review of budget. Government of Odisha has a climate finance cell and a climate budget statement, because Odisha is highly exposed to climate vulnerabilities. All these cyclones and all regularly is affecting Odisha coast. Tamil Nadu has created a SPV, special purpose vehicle, which will deal with climate related issue. Kerala has a climate disaster management plan at the panchayat level. So it's not that it's not happening, it is happening in many parts of the world also. So somebody should list out, I think some of you, if you're interested, just work on those areas and see what are the positives. We have negatives. West doesn't want to do, developing countries will have to take this forward, etc. are fine. But developing countries also have done a lot of things. So what all things they have done? There needs to be a depository of that. We should find out what they have done, what they have not done, what they should be doing. And these are available. Somebody has to go dig data, look at their websites, and find out what all policy actions taken by different countries through their budget, outside budget, through corporate social responsibility, through global coordination, all kinds of things. And then one can really help. I think we're talking a lot on climate, doing a lot also on climate, but I think we should do more on climate.
So let's manage discussion. So we can start first, and then please raise your hand first. Okay.
So Professor, my question would lean more towards the trade side of global uncertainties. So
Right.
as we talked about the global supply chain crisis, and when we say US, China is not in coordination as Lucy with Taiwan, so a lot of things are happening in the international relations context. So considering India as a hub, do you think that the supply chains will now shift from China to India or other global south countries? Do you think we have the capacity to do that?
Well, I haven't looked at this issue very carefully, but India is a very important global player now, both in terms of its economy, in terms of the volume of the economy, and also in various global forums. But supply chain, we should not start with an objective of you should be part of this global supply chain. India should be, and I think a major player in global supply chain where India has its comparative advantage. Like the way software, India was the hub. That's not the supply chain. It was originating here. So the point here is that wherever we have gotten services, we have a major advantage, and services does not require movement of volume and movement of goods. So that is already there. On the key services sector, manufacturing sector then has to really take lead, and our manufacturing share in the GDP is not very high. So those services we have been doing very well, and that has also got to do with the skill, because India had big IITs since independence, right? Great institutions, good human resources were produced and being produced. So the point is that benefits we are reaping now. But manufacturing sector was largely public sector driven. It was quite inefficient in many ways. But after privatization, things have changed. Services had grown at a faster rate than the manufacturing. I think that manufacturing sector has to grow to create more jobs, because everybody cannot be accommodated in the service sector job. And the service sector, you do see that people are working, but then there is issue of inequality, job condition. Decent jobs are very important. So how do you create decent jobs? And manufacturing sector has the capacity to create decent jobs, because it is fixed hour of work, and good wages, if it is competitive and efficient. So services, we have large service sector in the informal economy, right? Where there is no rule, there is no regulations. So what regulations, and rules you are bound by when you employ domestic help? Nothing, right? So that you cannot do. It's wrong. But we all do that. So I think service sector also needs to be, the market needs to have certain social protection measures, social security measures. So these are very important. Unless we have that, I'm not giving just an example. It's there everywhere. Go to a restaurant. Does he get a pension? Does he get a provident fund? Is there a health security? It's not there. Is there a health insurance? It's not there. So the service sector is formal service sector, high value service sector that contributes large part of the service value added. It doesn't employ a large number of people. Okay. So that is another problem within the service sector. So there are a lot of challenges. Yes.
So why did we jump directly from the primary to tertiary sector in agriculture?
No, I don't think we jumped. It happened.
I mean, we didn't involve much of the manufacturing sector, why?
No, manufacturing sector, I think our mixed economy, large public sector producing television, when I was small, all state governments used to produce television. And so point is that government should not be producing goods that are for private consumption. Our manufacturing sector was driven by production of private goods. Why should government have Ashoka Hotel? Does it have an impact on governance, you tell me?
Huh? It doesn't know. So government used ITC, bought some of the hotels from the government. So I think that was a time when mixed economy, large public sector presence actually had an impact on manufacturing. But to be very honest, that's a very general answer, but one has to look at more specifics. You should talk to somebody who works on manufacturing sector as a scholar. I am not a scholar who works on these areas, but certainly I think public sector, the way our development strategy was, it had an impact on why we have not. But we invested a lot on high-end education. We had IIMs from the early since independence. We had good institutions, good universities, etc., which actually then started paying dividends when computer revolution happened, softwares, etc. Manufacturing में वो नहीं हुआ. So people could not move from agriculture to industry and then to services. So we still hold a large section of the people in agriculture doing nothing.
Yeah, and also they are not able to compete government. Government is having government productive institutions, so private sector is not able to compete them. So they can start give first initiative to the sector and to the market, and then later on calling private sector to come and start investing. So maybe this is what the Indian government has missed to do. So they have remained for a long time investing, and also it is putting pressure on public finance, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think it will be good to look at these issues in more detail. Some of you could do that.
So there is 2 questions here first, yeah.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, sir, for this great lecture. It was really insightful for me and helped me broaden my view on the topic. My question is, like you mentioned, one of the reasons for the global economic uncertainty that we face is increase in money supply. So we all know what US Fed did during COVID, like it pumped in a large amount of money into not just the USA economy, which eventually trickled down into the global economy. If I remember correctly, it pumped around $3 trillion in a short span of time. And as you said, that amount of money could not be used in the health sector. So what rationale do you see by the US Fed for pumping in such a large amount of money? And if you could throw some light on what different they could have done, or you see it as one of the major reasons for global inflation?
I think it's an issue of instruments to be used to deal with a crisis when you do not have revenue. So US started giving large-scale stimulus to the economy because health-related response was, in a comparative sense, much lower than the overall money they have pumped in. But I am not saying that you should only spend on health because it was COVID. COVID impacted the economy, so you needed to put in money. So there is no problem in giving money for economic recovery. But I think the kind of money supply monetization they did, that is now striking back in terms of high inflation. That time it was not really considered in a manner that one should have, that this has implications. But that's why there was a global pressure. Once US did, everybody started saying, you also do. So most other countries followed US in terms of policy, saying that yes, money supply is fine, you can do it because it's a crisis. If you don't do it, when will you do? But the crisis, and the fundamental point here about a crisis is that crisis is, when there is a big crisis, it comes, it also goes. So we are facing, when things started getting normal, economy started opening up, and this excess money supply in the system is now creating a major issue. So how much should have been that fiscal stimulus? That should have been really carefully thought. It is not about number, bigger is better. That kind of an approach that they have taken. So that is not the right approach.
Okay. So question here.
Good afternoon, Professor. My name is Srishti. I'm just going to steer the conversation back to climate change and how our countries handle such a crisis. Do you feel that India should be taking some inspiration from Nepal perhaps and should incorporate an exclusive sustainability budget to incorporate some transparency in handling climate change?
India is also doing. India has a state action plan for climate change. India also has a climate finance budget statement for state of Odisha, as I mentioned. India also has, accounted, I think, the money that central government spends on budget, but they don't have a climate budget statement. But it is important to have that to track, if you are making investment. But this has to be meaningfully done, because in many times, if you say that my work in say X has a climate implication, so it is a climate related spending. That also may not be right. So you also need a detailed framework.
My question is also similar to the economic stimulus that was so in after during because of this Ukraine-Russia crisis, Germany has said they are going to provide an economic stimulus because of the energy crisis that is happening, and the EU is against it. So my question is why is an economic stimulus given in one country being opposed by others? Or what is the implication?
No, I didn't get the question. Can you please repeat?
So the question is, why an economic stimulus given in one country is being opposed by others? How is it going to affect?
Who opposed?
Germany is giving economic stimulus, right? So EU is actually opposing it.
US.
EU, because Germany is part of EU, so they
EU is opposing it.
because they are superpower over Germany as part of EU.
Germany is the German economy. See, EU member countries probably do not want German economy to, to have a high debt, high inflation, high interest rate, because German economy is, what should I say, the core center of economic activity of entire EU, given that after Brexit it has become even more important. So, that's what I'm saying, that, the first 6 months of the COVID crisis, when crisis was just unfolding and everything was shut, we thought the economy, major global power thought that just pumping in money will solve the problem. Even at that point in time, I said you should reduce, in discussions with, not that I had told them, okay, I'm just a prof. So I said, my argument was with my friends and colleagues, when we had such discussions, I said it is always better not to go for a bigger and bigger stimulus. Rather, it should be more nuanced, targeted, sector specific. Yes, if somebody is borrowing, somebody has to pay, no? So bigger stimulus is a better stimulus. Bigger is better kind of an approach is a wrong approach. It should have been more nuanced. It should have been more carefully done. That they did not do. They thought more money pumping in would help economy recover on its own, which hasn't happened. Economy recovered when COVID subsided, mobility increased, growth started picking up. What you needed at that point in time was to give huge support to the people in the informal sector, migrant laborers, and those who are in the contact intensive sector like tourism, travel, industry, hospitality industry and all that. There you should have had, and since the large part of the US and UK and EU economy, entire world economy is, entire Western world economy, especially North America and EU, are formal economies, everybody having a social security number, etc., you could have done it more effectively. Rather than pumping in money when there was no way to spend. How can you make capital investment when you are not allowing people to get out of the house? These are make capital investment. Strange ideas. So if you are not making capital investment, you are also saving money, no? So that money you should have spent on supporting a household's budget. And that's the kind of thing India did. I think it needs to be studied. It's quite successful. India provided food kit. I know there are stories where state government instituted, a WhatsApp system saying that if you want to surrender your food quota, you just send an SMS to the local commissioner and your food kit will be given to somebody else because everybody did not require a food kit. So a lot of people surrendered that food kit, which increased coverage. So I think sometimes simple things work better. But sometimes it doesn't. So sometimes making things more complex create more complexities. I think that's what the world is facing. It made it more complex. But we need careful analysis, all these.
I have two questions. So, US Secretary Treasurer Janet Yellen, she mentioned a term called friendshoring, that is limiting the key inputs to supply chains to countries with similar levels of development, especially with their allies. So, but we know that because to reduce risk to supply chains, and we know that the global supply chain that works at present is because the developing countries, even they participate, bringing their comparative advantage to the table. As a result, the benefits, the world gets cheaper goods. That is, the companies they produce, they manufacture goods wherever it is cheapest to do so. The benefits are retrieved by all. But we see that there is a resurgence in protections, augmented by new geopolitical rivalries. That is why they are trying to limit their input of technologies to their allies. But the companies won't adhere to it. They want to produce things wherever it is cheapest to do so. So, what will the companies do when the government is forcing them to follow such friendshoring policies? And what do you think such policies will have an effect on the international trade?
Well, I've been reading about it. Not that I have a definite answer for your question. It's an important observation, I would say. But there are various, indications of, slowing down the process of globalization, right? So tariff walls are increasing. Now already we had many non-tariff barriers. That is further going to go up. And this is one form of such creating a block through technology collaboration among the friendly countries, okay, and then create a comparative advantage for themselves and for the rest of the world. This is also partly to to probably deal with the growing influence of China in the entire export basket. I think that whatever said and done, US economy depends for most of its consumer goods export from China. So that is also there. Fourth, I think it is also very important to understand that when there is a realignment happening in many ways, and those realignments are showing different kind of manifestations in different countries in terms of policies. And these manifestations are all common. One common feature of this manifestation is your protectionism and non-cooperation. It is a reflection of that. But this is not going to work. This is not going to work because of two reasons. See, globalization, there is a retreat of globalization now, if we may say so. That's because we have made capital completely mobile. So capital can move on the click of a button of a computer from this part of the world to any other part of the world. But we have made labor movement more and more restricted. So people's movement have become really, look at the number of volume of illegal migration happening. That has increased manifold. People are traveling in inhuman condition for days to get to you go to Europe or to North America, right? So, read this book by Amitabh Ghosh, Gun Island. It's about illegal migration, how it happens. He describes the route. So the point here is that if you make capital mobile and no labor to use that capital to produce goods and services, eventually it is going to collapse. If not today, 50 years later. Okay. So now you are still not coming to terms with the fact that I cannot keep labor restricted and capital mobile. So you are saying, okay, I'll go back to I'll go back to a situation where I will restrict. I make globalization a slow process. So that is also happening. So there are a couple of things that are happening. Then there are a lot of other issues that is coming up. World is also divided on all kinds of non-economic factors, so that is one major factor that is affecting the global movement is also, the issue of migration from migration and then its economic benefits, migrants earning versus the residents earning, and then there are all kinds of debates you see. You never used to see this 20 years back, how much a Asian earned in US. But now you do see all the time saying that they make more money than us, so why should they take away our job? It was never thought that way. Other issue is demographic dividend. So the demographic is changing. So the entire Europe and US is now, you are having only aging population. So if you are not allowing people to migrate, you are expecting technology to take care of your service needs. Okay. But that also has its own limitations, right? Human intervention cannot be replaced just by technology. So I could have given this class online, but I feel very happy to come and deliver this lecture. That's the difference. So when we talk about technology and AI, so it's important, but it has its own limitations. Beyond a point, it is not going to work. So you are seeing manifestation of that. We are transiting through a very turbulent weather, and how it is going to shape up and where we land depends on the pilots. And there are multiple pilots who is running this system, right? There is only one pilot. So I think that landing we have to wait. I think it will take few more years to land, and I hope it will be a very safe landing and in a very nice place.
Africa as a continent accounts to around 30% of the world's mineral reserves and around 20% of the world's oil and gas reserves. But then we see other countries, MNCs coming into the continent and exploiting the resources. And Africa as a continent has a potential, it could be a potential economic player. Where do you think it went wrong? Why isn't the economy of continent
there are many reasons for that. One is globally, extractive, wherever there is, wherever the extractive industry is located, be it gold, be it diamond, be it coal, be it iron ore, the local economy is always poor. Look at Jharkhand, look at Bengal, look at Bihar, look at Madhya Pradesh, look at Chhattisgarh, the poorest region of India. So, what happens is, what happened here? There has been capital that exploited the labor, made profit, and the profit never came back to the region. So that is one. So that has happened globally wherever there were mineral resources. So there was expropriation of profit from that area, which did not help the local economy. So it was not plowed back to the local economy. That is one. Second thing is, there was, until very recently, there was colonial rule in the entire, a large part of, a major part of Africa. I think the Kenya was, liberated in 1960s, right? And 60s. Then you had apartheid rule in South Africa till the 90s, early 90s. And then you have not been able to, you have been very successful as a colonial ruler not to allow the local entrepreneur class to develop. So what is happening? So I always, sometimes we say that, we have only 4 or 5 big industries in India. You just imagine if they were not there. We don't talk about the counterfactual. If there are no Tatas, if there are no Birlas, if there are no Reliance, if there are no big companies that we are talking, or Airtel Bharti for that matter, so what would have happened to India's corporate sector? We take a lot of pride in India Inc. And then we say that, no, this is not right, this is very unequal. So I think one has to be a bit balanced. So you just imagine the counterfactual. They're not there. It's all covered by Amazon. Then what will you do? So you need local capitalists, local entrepreneurs who will save, invest in the local economy. If you don't have it, then last was aid, So when Africa was poor, highly indebted, so a lot of aid was given. And aid has its own problem because aid is given, it's a one-size-fits-all approach, Aid works the same way for you and same way for me. That's the fundamental definition of definitional flaw of aid. The same conditions were imposed on various countries. It did not work beyond a point. So aid dependency resulted in, economy not doing that great. Probably all these things were realized. In fact, IMF also stated in its statement that their African policies were not that great, and etc., or some recognition of that. But then what happened was Africa started growing. And Kenya was one of the fastest growing. South Africa became part of the BRICS, doing well. After the 90s, some of the other countries decentralized, became democratic, like Nigeria, though there were ethnic clashes still continuing, but things transformed in many parts of Africa. But then, again, COVID came, and now I hope they recover and at least go quickly to the pre-COVID level of economic growth and social development. That's my understanding of Africa. I don't work on Africa. Some friends are there, so I talk to them. So it's just.
Sir, also you have China now coming into a lot of African countries doing construction and infrastructure projects, and that makes them again dependent on China. China traps them in their all their activities.
Yes, there's a lot of Chinese investment in entire Africa. Yeah, that is correct.
To counter US.
The Chinese debt has been one of the highest bilateral debts in the world. So it's not given by World Bank or IMF. It is given by China. Read about it. There's a very nice paper. I'll send it to Dr. Adam, that link. You can circulate it to them on Chinese state.
Yeah, it would be. Can we take one last question?
Yes.
So my question is that now there are various black swan events like the Russo-Ukrainian war and the COVID pandemic. How can countries prepare themselves for any future black swan events? Because there is now the fear of China and Taiwan conflict within the next 3 to 5 years.
See, there are two kinds of issues. One is if there is an aggression, war, and all, on that. Only thing that will work, you would know better. I don't know, because I don't work on international relations and diplomacy. So you should answer that question, not me. But I think when it comes to other disasters, like natural disaster, like this thing. Economic catastrophe like COVID, health catastrophe like COVID, I think we need to invest. I think there is a lecture, I am borrowing from that lecture given by Vito Tanzi at National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, where I was a director until very recently. So where Vito Tanzi has said that we invest a lot on risk. So, but we make very little investment to reduce the risk. For example, every one of us are insured, right? I have a health insurance. You may be having, young kids, I don't know what kind of insurance they have, so maybe having some insurance. So a lot of, everybody buy insurance, right? So insurance is what? A hedge against risk, no? But nobody makes investment to reduce the risk, and that's a big problem. So I might get a heart attack, so that's why I have taken an insurance. But I would certainly not look for a sustainable lifestyle which can reduce the possibility of my heart attack, so that I get an insurance at a much lower cost. I'm a healthy person. So that is one major problem. So we invest a lot on risk, we don't invest on uncertainties. And if we have to reduce uncertainties, you have to invest on climate, the point I made. If you want to reduce uncertainties, you have to invest in building peace across the world, so, which is not happening. If you have to reduce uncertainties, you have to make the society more equitable. That is not happening. So this is, sounds pessimistic? No, I don't want young kids to be pessimistic, but I'm just telling. It's a realism. Huh? So try for more investment in uncertainties, less on risk. Don't buy insurance, okay?
Okay, so before ending this really interesting and insightful discussions that we had this morning with you, Professor, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for accepting my invitation and making your time to come and join us today. It was a long way from Delhi in this weather. Of course, traffic was difficult, so I really appreciate your that you have joined us and you have given this insightful, thought-provoking lecture to my student. And of course, we will work together on having future collaboration in the future. We'd be delighted to establish a long cooperation with you. Thank you so much, Professor. And before ending, I just would like to present to you a memento from GGU. I'm really thankful for you. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so can we take a picture?
Yes.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was really great pleasure. Professor, can we take a picture with you
Yes,
as a
yes.
group picture?
Kishore is calling me, I just.
Yeah. So try to come from this side, okay? We can have a group picture.
I forget